Montague Rhodes James prominently worked as a medievalist scholar with antiquarian talents and knowledge, and told ghost stories to friends in spare time as evening entertainment, with no interest in being an author. It was only after encouragement from some of his friends that his first collection of ghost stories would be published in 1904. Over the many years that his stories have existed, he has grown a massive legacy of being, what some will say, the best author of ghost stories ever. His stories fell into their own category of the genre, as for being ones that had overall themes or elements of ancient artifacts, in turn reflecting the interests of James himself. After the first volume of tales entitled Ghost Stories of an Antiquary, another three were published in his lifetime. These collected most, if not all, of the completed stories of his in print. However, a handful of incomplete and unfinished stories are known to exist. To give some perspective and insight into what I have in my collection and what there is of the figure's work, here are some editions of his stories that I so happen to own. It appears that this one was originally made and released in 1973, but I believe I have what I think is a second edition from 1974, and I was lucky enough to buy this for only £2.50 in a local charity second-hand bookshop, I believe. It has 15 stories, lithographic illustrations, and an introduction by Nigel Neal over about 230 pages. It is hardback bound with a beautiful and spooky cover, and comes with a slipcase as well. For the other two editions I have, there is this Tales of Mystery and the Supernatural paperback collected edition, which contains 30 stories along with an introduction, along with a piece written by James himself about why he writes stories. This doesn't have any illustrations to it or anything like that. This pocket edition that I have has this autobiographical section within as well, but it has 33 stories as opposed to the paperback that I just showcased. Looking into his stories thanks to reading the original texts of some and watching various adaptations of his work, it is most definitely apparent to me that James very much harnessed his knowledge and interests in the overall creation and construction of his stories. "Oh, Whistle and I Will Come to You, My Lad" is arguably his most famous story. A quirky archaeologist is on holiday, and when walking along some sand dunes of a nearby beach to his hotel, they discover a relic buried in the sand. Taking the titular whistle back to their room, an inscription is found on it, a Latin one. However, upon using it, they unleash a terrifying preternatural force. This for me is definitely one of the better stories I have come across from the canon of stories by Montague, as my prominent exploration of them is through television, with myself having only read a handful of the original printed ones currently. Both of the adaptations from '68 and 2010 I enjoy thoroughly. The first one, starring Michael Hordern in the lead role, is quite the stunning piece in my opinion, with it lending itself to the black and white picture format very well. It took me 2 watches to get what it was going for, as it is more on the unusual side of the A Ghost Story for Christmas productions, but I will still say it is brilliant. Our main character in this is very much unhinged and not altogether mentally, and this production not only has a well-constructed main protagonist, but a balance between showing the supernatural force and the postulation as to if it is in his head is executed greatly. Online and from being in an M.R. James group, most people seem to favour this one over the more modern John Hurt starring one, and whereas I can see why, I would still say that this newer one from 2010 is a worthy watch and also a fantastic short film. It is definitely more deviant from the source material, unlike the earlier 1968 iteration, but it is more accessible overall also. The original printed story for me is also a great experience and a very enjoyable atmospheric read. The 1968 omnibus edition of the story very much laid down the groundwork for what was to come with A Ghost Story for Christmas in the 1970s, and I personally view it as a pilot episode for this main series. The first one to follow this was The Stalls of Barchester in 1971, in turn being the first of 8 short films with the overall series title in the 1970s. A scholar is inspecting a diary which details events leading up to the mysterious death of a former archdeacon of the Barchester Cathedral. The story was originally published in the 1910s and housed in Emma R. James's second volume of stories titled More Ghost Stories of an Antiquary. Its adaptation discussed here is one of only 2 that I have come across in any medium, the other being a short radio adaptation from the 1990s. My journey with this series started off with the 4th volume in the series, being the Signalman and the 2 original scripts that I will talk about later. The first of these 3 became the first one that I watched. In turn, checking out more of the films, I backtracked and went to the second DVD release chronologically, in turn watching The Stalls of Barchester and A Warning to the Curious. I was very impressed with the second overall piece from this series from the offset, with its sweeping scenery and expert use of location filming, but this first one didn't faze me much from an initial viewing. It wasn't until a second watch that I fully got what it was going for and how well done it is. This adaptation is a fantastic and very enjoyable spooky watch, not to mention a good opener for the entire series, but the best was yet to come in my opinion. Our protagonist, Peter Vaughan, has the knowledge of a legend of 3 Anglo-Saxon crowns, 2 of which are known to exist and are documented, but the 3rd is missing. Setting out on an investigation, he ends up finding the ghost crown, and in turn has assistance with a returning Dr. Black, who appeared in the Stalls of Barchester. Only question is the reward for finding it going to be positive or sinisterly negative? In 2021, a novella called The Tale of the Tailor and the 3 Dead Kings was published, penned by author Dan Jones. This was a book that I had in my collection for a while before reading it, and whenever I was writing this episode, I had some personal speculations about it after seeing things about it online. I ended up reading it as a bit of research and as a general bit of interest for today's video. I read the introduction provided a couple days before the main story itself, and there it explains that this book is an adaptation of a short story discovered by Montague himself. James himself was sifting through manuscripts in the British Museum when he discovered a collection of several medieval ghost stories that dated back a handful of centuries during the early 1920s. I thought that since the original text of A Warning to the Curious was first published in the last collection of ghost stories by the author in 1925, that it was possible that he was inspired to write this one from his own historical discovery. Now, coming from the perspective of me having experienced the main story from the book, I will say that what I had thought is possible, but only slightly, and perhaps James loosely based his story on it, as there are 3 dead kings mentioned. Interestingly enough, sheets of paper with runic writing are mentioned within, which is one of the key elements to another one of the most famous stories by this main author today, casting the runes. However, this particular tale first made a text appearance back in 1911, which would have predated the manuscript's discovery. So whether this is a coincidence that happened back in the day, or if this is a sneaky little nod put in by Dan Jones in this publicised modern version, I cannot say. The third adaptation of one of his tales underneath the A Ghost Story for Christmas television banner was Lost Hearts. A young orphan is set to stay with his older alchemist cousin at a hall, only to be tormented by apparitions of a young boy and girl who have their hearts missing. This is the first time we encounter a parallel to this particular show and Mystery and Imagination, going by this main one's chronological order, as the story was also adapted for that series back in the 1960s. Of the 18 installments that comprised the first 3 series, 4 of them were adaptations of James's work: the tractate Midoof, Lost Hearts, Room 13, and Casting the Runes. None of these particular ones exist anymore, sadly, although poor quality audio recordings of the first 3 and a video clip from Runes exist. Also, in doing my research, I have found a black and white 50-minute Italian adaptation of Room 13, which I have subsequently downloaded for posterity as a fan of the story. This particular version was uploaded to YouTube and was on there for quite some time before I found it, and I have no idea what this would categorically fall into with regards to lost media as such. Almost all of the productions in the original run I absolutely love, and this being no exception. However, it is also one that I have only seen once for whatever reason, and I'm saving my rewatch for the upcoming Blu-ray release of the program. A very creepy and well done production, I would have said overall, and one that I would recommend checking out. This entry was originally released in a triple pack DVD with the 4th and 5th films in the series, The Treasure of Abbot Thomas and The Ash Tree. Both of these are, again, great pieces, but ones that took me 2 watches to appreciate for some reason. Quite as to why this is the case with some of the series, I have no idea, but what I can say now on them is very positive. The first of these is one that sticks out in my head as being very memorable. By this point in the series, if you have seen Whistle 68 or A Warning to the Curious, then there is a familiar setting for a plot with the discovery of a treasure and in turn unleashing a supernatural force. However, this one combines a study of history, so you kind of get a mixture of either of the just mentioned 2 and the Stalls of Barchester with this one. Honestly, with more familiarity, I can easily see this being one of my favourites from the whole run. The way this episode plays out and how it is structured is fantastic. Several moments are ingrained in my head. The studying of some artifacts leading to the discovery of the treasure, the sequence showing the lengths of one of our main characters retrieving it, not to mention a very creepy shot involving a door near the end as well. Superb. In regards to the Ash Tree, this out of the 6 adaptations present in the 1970s run of the films is the weakest, I would have said, but still is a pretty great watch. It is a pretty interesting take on a ghost story, with it being about a haunting created by a witch, but it isn't going to be one of the films that I would jump to and say is the absolute best. In saying that, it does have some particularly effective moments, such as the phantasmagorical creatures that are shown near the end that really stick out in my mind as being extremely creepy. At this point, the programme had adapted 5 different M.R. James stories and had been a success, but at this point liberties was decided to be taken with it. The Ash Tree featured some bits of nudity, which was the first time that any of these productions had done so, but this was only the first sign. The last 3 shorts that the series comprised of was an adaptation of a Charles Dickens story, The Signalman, and 2 original scripts being Stigma and The Ice House, not to mention that the latter is the only one of the 8 not to have been directed by Lawrence Gordon Clark. Was this at all successful? Well, yes and no, but the non-adaptations, which I personally don't have much to say about, Stigma is a decent piece about curses and a stone circle, And whereas I do think it is an enjoyable entrance in the series, I do see why it is overshadowed and forgotten about, however. With the Ice House, on the other hand, I don't really have a single positive thing to say about this one, unfortunately. This would be the last A Ghost Story for Christmas film for 27 years, and it is safe to say that the run in the 1970s ended with a whimper and not a bang. To me, regardless of their actual quality, neither of these two films belong in this series, as they go more into the territory of folk horror, and there is only one moment in either of them, being Stigma, involving a bitten onion, that fits into the series by its very concept. It just makes me wonder what the hell happened, and how it could have gone so wrong in regards to this complete misunderstanding of the series. And it's not like the BBC didn't know how to make an original ghost story of quality in the 70s. Dead of Night, A Woman Sobbing, Lady Sybil from Supernatural, and some episodes of Out of the Unknown, for example. And whereas I will say that the former of the two is decent, the second is anything but. The Ice House, at the end of the day, is an extremely weak piece of ill-defined folk horror. It has no glimpses of a ghost story at all, it severely lacks a plot, and what there is of one is not explained at all. Did I mention what it presents is absolutely ridiculous and is carried off by very stiff acting. Both of these films are fairly well shot and put together, but they severely lack the magic of the previous 6 entrants and very often the quality as well. Lastly, I would like to talk about the Signalman, and boy oh boy have I saved the best for last. An unnamed character, referred to as the Traveller in the credits of the film, spots a signalman in a valley-like clearing of a train track, standing outside of their control box. They make eye contact, but the latter seems scared and retreats back into his cabin. The other ventures down to find a disturbed and frightened man. The following night, the now emotionally collected signal worker reveals to the Traveller that they unintentionally mimicked a spirit that the employee has spotted on 2 separate occasions. A ghoul that seems to be an omen for impending disasters in the dank and black tunnel behind them. Yesterday, to the day that I originally wrote this particular block, I ended up watching the YouTube video 5 Haunted London Underground Stations and Their Dark Histories by Top 5s. I mention this particularly whenever talking about this film here, because my watch of this video made me realise how good of a setting a train station is, particularly the London Underground, for the paranormal. Whenever I think about how much a train station can be battered by in terms of history, humans and even violence, it adds a certain gravitas and aura to one of these particular fixtures, and makes them absolutely perfect for something paranormal for me. Not to mention how that the long and winding tracks stretch into the darkness of tunnels is and or are utterly creepy whenever I think about the paranormal. I could also add even more context to the story here by also saying how this was potentially a story written by Charles Dickens based on how he had a lucky escape from a train crash that he almost died in. This particular crash was the 1861 Clayton Tunnel crash, which occurred on the 25th of August that year. Only 5 years later, the original text story would be published. I would also say that it is possible that parts of the film were based on the crash, as a certain detail on the Wikipedia article for the accident echoes a moment in the episode. The whole series up to this point had absolutely fantastic direction and utilization of sound. However, by the point of this entry, it seems like these aspects were absolutely perfected in my opinion. Atmosphere was something that had been very well crafted and handled in the series previously, with great utilization and sound and music throughout. Here in The Signalman, some of the finest examples of this from the series is present. For example, Partway through, there is a shot that zooms into the cloaked phantom, with it slowly revealing its face, whilst a high-pitched sound plays that gradually grows in intensity. It's things like this that help to add to the eerie and presence that these productions had. The shots and overall conduction of the proceedings by Lawrence Gordon Clark is an all-time high here as well. One such moment that I would like to highlight is during a flashback type sequence in which the titular signalman is recounting a train crash in the tunnel. In it, there is this beautiful and symmetrically framed shot of three figures carrying out a white dress wearing corpse. Other highlights are everywhere to be found, I would have said, such as the two main characters talking in the signal box, all the various shots of the tunnel, all within the tunnel itself. I could go on forever about how much I love this short film, but I will simply wrap up here by saying that it is the greatest thing I have ever watched. In 1978, A Ghost Story for Christmas wrapped up after a successful run of annual ghost stories with 8 short films underneath its belt at this point. Because of how this was a series that only crops up with 1 episode per year, it very much travelled across the 1970s and rode the wave that was this decade's horror television shows. As such, there are many others that can be closely associated with it, and many that were inspired by and done because of the success of this collection. There is a lot of what can be seen as essentially supplemental programs and productions to this main one that are worth checking out and are very enjoyable. Some of the most major ones of which I'll be mentioning here and in the future of this channel in other videos. The first one of these that I would like to talk about is Schalcken the Painter. This piece starts off by showcasing the artwork and many of the pictures by a painter called Gottfried Schalcken, which is later linked back into with the ending that very neatly ties it all together. The main narrative is overviewed and narrated, which showcases Schalcken as a young aspiring painting student in his early days. Included are scenes of him doing various exercises with the art medium, which includes models and several boobies. Gottfried in this is given some great character work, including his feelings of love towards his tutor's daughter, Rose Velderkaust. But partway through, a strange figure by the name of Vanderhausen appears and our main character is asked to carry out a task, being the evaluation of some gold this figure presents to him and the Velderkausts. But is Vanderhausen who, or rather, what he seems? This was a 1979 70-minute television feature based on a story by famous Irish author Sheridan Le Furnau, who is known for works like Uncle Silas and Carmilla, the latter of which being a vampire story that so happened to predate Bram Stoker's Dracula by over 20 years, as well as Victorian ghost stories. To me, this is quite significant to have an adaptation by this author that can fit into the framework of A Ghost Story for Christmas, as M.R. James looked up to Sheridan as being one of the best writers of ghost stories during his lifetime, and was influenced greatly by them. Overall, this makes for a truly excellent companion piece to the series, and one I would highly recommend adding to the collection if you have not got it already. It is every bit as good and atmospheric as the very best of the main series counterparts. Truly superb.